Very patient all day, and we're going to wrap up here with a bit of a global view, bouncing around the planet. And without any further ado, let me introduce Dr. Jenny Reese, who is from the Australian electricity market operator and was intimately involved in one of the more famous episodes in the evolution of renewables in South Australia. So, Jenny, the floor is yours.
So this is a major event that happened in South Australia, which, as I mentioned before, is a very vulnerable part of our grid in terms of the amount of renewables that we have in that system. So just a bit more detail on the South Australian region to kind of set the context. This is actually very difficult to see from here. There's load centres. I really can't see this angle. So the Adelaide load centre is about here. There's bunches of wind farms up here and here. And then we have an HVDC link. Thank you. An HVDC link here to 220 megawatts. And our AC link, the Hayward Interconnector, 650 megawatts here. And this system is about 800 kilometres end to end. So it's a long, stringy grid with a demand of between 1 to 3 gigawatts, about 1,700 megawatts of wind installed, as I mentioned, in the north and the south, and about 800 megawatts of rooftop PV, just to set the scene. There we go. There's our load centre and the wind farms there. So what happened on this day? We had a large storm front approaching. So these are the weather radar images that you can see. We knew that the forecast was quite severe for wind speeds in the 120 to 140 kilometres per hour range. But as far as we were aware, that was within the capabilities of that network. So we did not implement any measures to constrain down the network because we believed that that was within the capability of the network to withstand that. As it turned out, the storm was a lot more severe than that, and we actually had tornadoes within the storm, which caused wind gusts that were far in excess of that level. And that's unusual for our grid. So before the storm hit, this is how the system was operating. We had imports over the interconnector of about 600 megawatts. The wind was producing moderate amounts of energy, about 880 megawatts of wind generating at the time, and we had about 330 megawatts of thermal generation running on the system. All the lines were in service, and this was 4 different units, 4 synchronous units running on the system. Then, as the storm hit, we saw a series of faults, a series of voltage dips. Firstly, one in the Adelaide region in the 66 kilovolt network, and then another fault on the 275 kV network. And then a series of faults further in the north, again on the 275 kV network. So we believe that this was because of 2 separate incidents hitting separate lines that were many hundreds of kilometres apart within a couple of minutes by coincidence, causing a succession of faults in a very close time period. Then another few faults, 5 and 6, again on the 275 kV network, with lines tripping and then auto-reclosing, causing multiple voltage dips on the network. So it's hard to tell, that we did see transmission lines crumpling through this event. So there was a lot of transmission lines that came down. It's hard to tell whether the transmission lines collapsing caused the faults or whether the faults were happening due to conductors clashing and then the transmission lines crumpled following the system black event. But certainly this was very severe impact on our transmission network. So you can see here the succession of voltage dips that we saw over a period of about 2 minutes, these 5 voltage dip events occurring this is on the 275 kV network. So with that series of faults, this triggered protection systems on the wind farms. So it turns out that these wind farms have protection that's measuring successions of faults, and when they see a certain number of faults, they will trip off of the system to protect themselves. And this protection was unknown to us, and it was different for different groups. So we've grouped them as Group A, Group B, Group C, which are different types of turbines that are installed in our grid that had different protection settings. So the Group A turbines, for example, had settings, if they saw 2 faults within 2 minutes, then they would that would activate the protection to trip those turbines off. The Group B turbines had a setting if they saw 5 faults within 30 minutes, they would trip off, or if they saw 5 within 2 minutes, they would trip off the system. And we had different quantities of each of these installed, different settings for the different manufacturers in the system. And the reason for this protection is because to achieve the fault ride-through capability, to ride through these faults, there's a cooling cycle for the thermal capacity of the dump resistors that are being used in that process. And there is a limit to how many faults they can ride through, also depending upon the duration of the fault and the size of the voltage dip. So this protection serves an important purpose in protecting these wind farms from damage during multiple fault events. But this protection was not known to us as the system operator. It wasn't included in the models that we were provided to study system stability. And even if it had been, we don't routinely study multiple fault events when we look at system stability studies. We would typically only look at one fault for system stability. So we were unaware that this trip setting existed. So you can see how the wind farms behaved. This is the total wind generation in purple through the event, and this is the different groups of turbines that I talked about. So here's the Group A turbines. They see the fault and they all of a sudden trip off of the system and have a sustained reduction in output. Here's the Group B turbines. They managed to ride through this fault. And I should mention they successfully rode through a single fault. So they met our grid code for low voltage ride through and did that very successfully. It was with the multiple fault events. Here's the Group B turbines coming off the system. And then with the sustained reduction from the Group A and the Group B turbines lost, here is where we lost the interconnector and then went to system black. The Group D turbines were unaffected until the system black occurred. So it was dependent upon the type of turbine. So with the wind farm protection triggered, we lost 880 megawatts of supply in this region, an enormous proportion of the generation. That supply deficit then had to be made up by increased flows over the interconnector. The interconnector, when it hits around the 900 megawatt level, will tend to start to lose synchronism between the two sides of the interconnector, and that will then trigger the loss of synchronism protection. So you can see here the frequency in the system. Here is where we lost the second set of turbines, and then over a period of about 600 milliseconds, you can see frequency deviating between the two sides of the line in Victoria and South Australia. And then here is where the interconnector opens because of that loss of synchronism protection, which correctly operated to protect the interconnector through this event. So all of the relays operated as they should. There was an opportunity here in this 600 milliseconds, had we had an appropriate protection scheme set up that could have detected the loss of those wind turbines and that supply deficit, we could have corrected that by tripping load very, very quickly within 600 milliseconds to bring the system back into balance and avoid this loss of synchronism. And we're looking into developing a scheme that does that at the moment to avoid separation events. So once we lost the interconnector, we then went to system black because the frequency changed very rapidly. So this is the frequency sitting just below 50 hertz, and here's where the event happens where we lose the interconnector. Frequency was dropping in this event at around 6 hertz per second. So we over 0.4 seconds to drop to 47 hertz. This is a very extreme level of rate of change of frequency. For context, Ireland is worried about rock-off in the range, they have a standard of 0.5 hertz per second, and they're trying to move that to 1 hertz per second as their new standard. So this is a very, very extreme rock-off that we saw in this event. That rock-off is so fast that this is the range of frequency over which our under-frequency load shedding should operate. So we have load blocks that should trip at various frequencies to correct the imbalance and correct that supply deficit. But those load blocks have a measurement delay of between 150 and 250 milliseconds. And that's really important to avoid false triggering of those load blocks tripping. But when you have those sorts of delays, if you're moving at 6 hertz per second, there simply isn't time to save the system when it's moving that quickly. So with that frequency drop, we went straight through to a blackout of the state. So there was no single issue. It was a real combination of factors that happened here, with tornadoes that weren't forecast, many towers collapsing, causing multiple grid voltage dips, then these preset ride-through limits that we weren't aware of and weren't operating the system with an awareness of that. That huge supply deficit causing the increase in flows on the interconnector, causing loss of synchronism, and with the very low inertia system, seeing the frequency fall very fast, such that under-frequency load shedding couldn't operate quickly enough. So an enormous number of issues all occurring together. Now, we have seen separation events very similar to this in the past. There was one back in 1999, 2004, 2005. These previous ones were due to trips at Northern Power Station, which is a big coal-fired power station that has now retired, where we lost an amount of supply, a very large amount of supply, which very similarly caused an overload on the interconnector, which then tripped. In those previous events, it didn't lead to a system black. We were able to achieve a stable island system in South Australia. And the primary reason for the difference is because the inertia was very different. In these previous events, we had an inertia of 10,000 megawatt seconds, 7,000, 11,000 megawatt seconds, which means that the rate of change of frequency is slow enough that we can catch the system with under-frequency load shedding. This event, we had an inertia of only 3,000 megawatt seconds, which was far too low, and meant that the system moved, as we said, at 6 hertz per second, far too quickly to catch. So there's been an enormous amount of work following this event, and there's an enormous report that you can read if you're interested in knowing more. But very briefly, some of the things that have been implemented in response to this. We have changed the wind farm settings to now withstand a much larger number of voltage disturbances. And that was actually achieved quite quickly. That was done within a couple of weeks of the event. There was a very strong motivation because immediately following the event, all of the wind farms that were involved were placed under a constraint that constrained them down as a credible contingency event to lose them all simultaneously. And so that meant if they were being constrained down, they were losing dollars. So they had a very strong incentive to change those settings quickly, which they did. And now they have been removed from that constraint because they can withstand a much larger number of voltage dips. We've also implemented a rock-off constraint on the Hayward interconnector that limits flows on the interconnector to 3 hertz per second. So that constraint is measuring the amount of inertia in the South Australia region. And if that inertia is becoming low, it will constrain down the flows on the interconnector. So the rock-off can't get to such extreme levels, at least for the loss of the interconnector alone. And we now have a requirement for a minimum number of online synchronous generators in South Australia, which should keep the inertia and the system strength to higher levels. There's also an enormous number of recommendations that are still in progress. We're looking at changing the generator licensing conditions to make sure that all new units coming in can withstand multiple fault events and higher rock-off levels and so on. We're looking into a special protection scheme which will rapidly initiate load shedding and prevent separation, as I mentioned. We're also looking into our system restart process. There was a lot of learnings out of restarting the system. It's something that happens very rarely. In this particular event, we have a requirement to have 2 different providers of a system restart service. One of those providers was damaged in the storm and was not available. The other one, when they attempted the restart process, there was a very subtle difference in the process that was used in the testing regime and the process that was used in an actual event, which meant that they actually didn't function properly during the system restart. Fortunately, we were able to restart by re-energizing through the interconnector to get them back online. But some important learnings there about how to refine that restart process and make sure that it is effective. We're also looking at management of generator type risks, because this is a completely new sort of risk that we now have to manage. So just to understand, the big challenge here is that we now have a very large number of units that are all identical to each other. So this is showing you a breakdown of the wind turbines that we have installed in South Australia by manufacturer and make. And you can see there's some very large chunks of multiple wind farms that are all of the same make and model of wind turbine. So just because they were very effective at selling their products, we have an awful lot of Suzlon S88s, Vestas V90s, Siemens, Vestas V80s. We've got large proportions of identical units in our system. And this creates a new risk that if the settings on this one particular type of turbine are all identical, you can lose them all at exactly the same time if there's some sort of a setting that we haven't anticipated that occurs. So a new kind of risk that we need to manage now in terms of thinking about possible contingency events on our grid. And this is also of concern for things like rooftop photovoltaics. Are we exposed to similar problems with PV inverters having all of the same make and model, having the similar settings? Distributed storage similarly. So doing some thinking about how we manage that. So as I mentioned, there is an enormous report with a lot more information, but it's certainly something that we've caused a lot of thinking and innovation in our grid. Thank you very much.
Hi, ma'am.
Hi.
You're not Constantine, but anyway. Okay. Go ahead. Just be quick, because we don't have much time. Go.
Okay. Yeah, Jared from CSR, Jared Wright. You mentioned there were 19 recommendations made. Were any of those tested in a sort of replay of the event, and which ones were the most effective in those recommendations that were made? Just from a sort of, I suppose, a model-based assessment of each of those recommendations.
Absolutely. So that there was a very structured process around looking at all of the possible points of intervention that could have avoided the event, and then working through each of those. But many of the recommendations relate to things like following this event there was a market suspension for the following week, and so we want it illuminated an opportunity then to put in place better processes. Or for example, the way that we reassess weather forecasts. We found that even though in this event we probably would not have changed our decision had we reassessed, it did highlight that we should do that kind of a reassessment. And so there's been those sorts of changes just through the process, scrutinizing very carefully what was done and what could be done better.
Okay, lady in the second row.
Hi, ma'am. My name is Maggie once again. I'm sorry that I did not listen to the whole presentation, but I just walked in. I saw in one of your recommendations you were talking about the interconnectors. So what I'm interested in is that these interconnectors, are they based on the wind power plant generation in terms of technology? When you spoke about these interconnectors.
The interconnector I'm talking about is the connector from South
from one
Australia
country
to Victoria.
to the other, yes.
Yeah, so 2 load regions.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the type of technology that they're using?
There's 2. There's an HVDC interconnector and there's one AC interconnector
okay, it's
as
just
well.
a normal interconnect.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Konstantinos.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Konstantinos Pieros. I'm with Enercon. I would like to ask you, am I right in saying that most of these turbines are rather older, doubly fed induction generator machines? I'm sorry for this.
There's a mixture. We do have a large proportion of the Type 3 defig turbines.
Yeah, but are they as well relatively older types? I saw quite a few Vestas V80s and 90s, and these are relatively older doubly fed induction generator models, so this might have affected their performance as well, on top of the incapability to ride consecutive faults.
Absolutely. I mean, the new turbines that we're looking at coming in are more of the Type 4, and we're certainly seeing a lot of expansion with the newer technologies, but the ones that are installed there at the moment, as you say, are older ones that were installed earlier. But they did, the turbines met the requirements for low voltage ride-through and did so very successfully as per required in our grid code. It's simply that there wasn't anything to say that they had to ride through multiple fault events.
Okay, I'm afraid we need to move on.
Thank you very much. First of all, this work was accomplished by researchers from Western Cape, Shandong and Upper Austria, and we all want to thank you very much to the WindAc conference team for inviting here and giving us the possibility to present. Recently, we are undertaking a monitoring process of renewable energy for partner regions, 7 partner regions, Bavaria, Georgia, Quebec, Sao Paulo, Shandong, Upper Austria, and the Western Cape. And within this, or as a result of this, we would like to show you some highlights regarding wind power of our partner regions. So this is why we will talk about regional roles and benefits of wind power. A short overview. At the beginning, I want to do a brief introduction to the RLS, the Regional Leaders Summit, the political framework of our network. Then I will give some data or show some results of our monitoring report regarding wind power in the regions. Then my colleague, Mrs. Ma from Shandong University, School of Electrical Engineering, will give us oversight of power highlights of Shandong, and then we want to conclude. So what is the Regional Leaders Summit RLS? It is a political framework, and under the principle of policy for generations, this Regional Leaders Summit is working on political perspectives and strategies for sustainable development of society, economy, and the environment. You see, for example, in North America, we have Quebec and Georgia. South America, it's Sao Paulo. In Africa, is represented by the province of Western Cape. In Asia, it's Shandong, and in Europe, it's Bavaria and Upper Austria. These partnership of the regions, they are home for around 180 million people, and they represent a GDP of more than 3,000 billion US dollars. So within this political framework, the RLS Energy Network was initiated after a meeting or subsequent to an RLS meeting in Sao Paulo in 2012. And it was agreed among the participants that renewable sources of energy require extensive research. So this network is used as a means to bring together complementary strengths in energy research to be shared and further developed in a joint effort. There are right now 4 topics we are focusing on. That's renewable energy, storage and conversion, energy efficiency, and waste to energy. There's also a homepage where we interact, there you can find research, publications, funding opportunities, and so on. Within this network, we have a roadmap. It's called the Regional Renewable Alliance, RRA, another acronym. And this is established a permanent scientific group under the umbrella of the Regional Leaders Summit. So the objectives of this alliance is to trigger new infrastructures, transnational transport and trade of renewable energy on a global scale. We have a preparatory stage, as you see. It's until 2020. That we want to evaluate key technologies and knowledge and energy potentials, and at the end, having an implementation and demonstration phase. So regarding this first stage, there's this monitoring activities followed by energy system analysis and technology mapping, and right now we are doing this monitoring of renewable energies. We have this database. As you see, it's not only wind, it's all renewable energy technologies from hydro over solar. Then we also cover topics of energy efficiencies, grid technologies, and so on. We want, with this database, provide the status quo of renewables in, and the potentials in the partner regions, and also identify scientific, industrial, and administrative key players. And after all, these data sets, which are coming from each region, they are merged and concluded or put together in a final monitoring report. We're also covering wind energy, as I said. The following slides, we present the wind power highlights or the objectives, trends, and research activities of the partner regions, as well as statistics for all regions compiled during this first initial monitoring process. First step was we had a look at the regional policy frameworks and targets. We can see that several regions, they have targets for increasing the amount of renewable energy or low carbon energy in the electrical generation mix. Sometimes these targets are based in legislation and appear in road mapping documents. Some of the regions, they have specific goals or targets for renewable energy in general and wind energy in particular. For example, if we are looking at Europe, Upper Austria and Bavaria, at this point of moment, the development of wind energy is limited due to road maps or master plans, for example. We have a look on ecological issues, and this is why wind power right now is stopped over there. But for example, if province of Shandong, there are quite, they have a wind power exploitation potential more than 30 gigawatts. In Georgia, wind power does not play a significant role. In Quebec, yes, and Sao Paulo as well, and of course in Western Cape. In all South Africa, there is a push to support wind energy, and the same happens in the province of Western Cape. If we have a look at the installed capacities, there is a total installed wind capacities in the selected partner regions in 2015. This is the point of time we got data for all of the regions. We have a total installed wind power capacity of around 19,000 megawatt. As I said, for the regions of Georgia and Sao Paulo, no detailed data was publicly available, or wind energy in the case of Georgia does not play an important role in the domestic energy system so far. Having a look, going more detailed to Shandong, there we have installed capacity around 13 gigawatt in 2015. There are about 12,000 gigawatt hours of electricity generated. We see for the years 2014 a capacity factor of 19, and 2015 it was 16. The main models have been developed from kilowatt to megawatt class. Installed turbine capacities of 1.5 megawatt or more accounted for more than 90% of the province wind turbines. Going to Upper Austria, this is another level of wind energy, let's say. There are 11 wind parks and single standing larger windmills with a total of 28 plants. There we have installed capacity around 40 megawatt and electricity generation about 72 gigawatt hours. And finally, where we also had a detailed look on the Western Cape, for the Western Cape we can say that there are around 190 turbines operating in 6 different wind parks, installed capacity around 440 megawatt, electricity generation around 1,300 gigawatt hours. And the capacity factor in 2017 we calculated of 35%. Other key impacts of wind energy implementation, I think we heard this during these 2 days. There are socio-economic effects. There might be due to wind energy impulses on the regional economy. For our regions, or we are having a look on, there we see employment effects around it, direct and indirect effects, Bavaria, Quebec, Upper Austria, and the Western Cape. We see in Bavaria about 12,000 people or having a full-time employment due to wind energy. Besides economic numbers, wind power also plays a significant role in reducing emissions that would otherwise be generated from conventional fossil sources. There we got data from 3 regions. For example, in Shandong, in the year 2008, a reduction of almost 22 million tons of carbon dioxide could be reduced. So we see there's this double dividend. On the one side, we have positive environmental effects. On the other side, positive effects on the economy as well. Besides economy and environment, we are also looking at research and development activities. Within the partner regions, several research and development activities in the field of wind energy are taking place. From Shandong, our colleagues are here. The Technology Research Center of Shandong University. There is a lot of wind power related business. In Upper Austria, my institute where I'm working at, we are looking at the storage of wind power. We're doing macroeconomic effects of wind power implementation, social acceptance issues. There's also in the industry, there are a lot of supplier and service companies working on wind energy. And finally, in the Western Cape, there are educational issues, there are environmental assessment, there are development undertaken by these institutions, Stellenbosch University, Saratech, of course sector development agency Green Cape, and a lot of interdisciplinary assessment undertaken by different institutions. Also the government of Western Cape, they have a sustainable energy database where we're also trying to get more information for our monitoring report. After this, I would like to ask my colleague to give a short.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sebastian, and thank you, Professor Steve, because you had a correct pronunciation of my name. Now I'm going to introduce the wind power highlights of Shandong province. I concluded 3 development conditions: geographical advantages, economic advantages, and government policy support and strategy. In terms of the geographical advantages, Shandong is a peninsula. The western part of the province is a mountainous area, but the east is surrounded by almost 500 small islands. So Shandong has quite long coastline, around 3,100 kilometers, which account for 1/6 of the total coastline of China. Through the examine, both the mountainous area and the coastline have high wind speed and short periods of calm wind. So, therefore, Shandong is a province that's rich in wind power resources. Specifically, please look at this map. In fact, the area of Shandong province only occupy 1.6% of the total land area of China. However, The percentage of population and the GDP are out of our imagination. They were all over 7% of the respectively, and as we can see from the at the same time, the large amount of population and higher GDP influence the electricity consumption of Shandong province. As we can see from the first pie chart, we can find that the electricity consumption of Shandong province was over 9% of the total electricity consumption of China. What's wrong? What's wrong with this? Hence, we can infer that Shandong province has potential of electricity in consumption, and wind power is a method to contribute to the increase in electricity demands. The last point is government policy support and strategy. Due to the serious environmental issues and the lack of coal, our government have been pushed to decrease the thermal electricity generation, but to increase the electricity generation by renewable energy, especially by wind power. During 12th five-year plan, our government planned to build 8 gigawatts of wind power, which included 2 gigawatts of offshore wind power. Now we are in the 13th five-year plan. At the beginning of 2015, our government intended to construct 15 gigawatt wind power, and 6 gigawatt power is offshore wind power. Besides, our government provides subsidy of 0.2 RMB equal to 3 cents per kilowatt hour to the wind power plants. Let's turn to the next part, the wind power outlook of Shandong province. Our government is going to build more than 23 gigawatts of wind power before 2030. Meanwhile, based on the topographical conditions, the Shandong government will mainly focus on the development of offshore wind power rather than onshore wind power. Apart from those, our government also estimated that the future wind power plants before 2030 will provide around 30,000 job opportunities, and approximately 5 million job opportunities will be supplied by related industries such as equipment manufacturing industry and ecological environmental protection. That's all my part. Thank you. Let's turn to Dr.
And then we already get to the conclusions. So in this road mapping process, we presented the major objective of the RLS energy network with regard to monitoring wind energy was the evaluation and harmonization of data. We had a look of installed capacities, the electricity generation, also socio-economic benefits. Due to these processes, the RLS wind regions can support and accelerate wind deployment in regions that are new to wind or can benefit from experience of regions that are successfully operating wind plants as part of their electrical systems. We have seen that the importance of wind energy in the regional energy system varies between the regions, resulting from different geographic and regulatory frameworks. Shandong and the Western Cape regions, they in particular show in our group of partner regions continuous expansion of wind power. Wind power has become one of the fastest growing renewable energy sources in those regions. And finally, also, although some RLS regions, they do not have binding targets for wind power and or low wind energy use, and the regional systems, there are economic benefits like value added, gross value added, or employment in these regions. So from all the researchers, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, yeah, I think there's still 6 states in the U.S. that don't have any wind power, and Georgia's one of them. So you could have picked 44 that had, but anyway. Questions?
I was just wondering if you, well, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering if you could disaggregate or talk a little bit about the job breakdown. Are these jobs that are for local people, or are folks bringing workers with them for these development projects? And what have you seen based on, you know, the regions that you've been looking at?
Thank you. Regarding the employment effects, these are actually case studies we were looking at and where we get the data from. I know that these are direct and indirect employment effects, and these are people, regional employment effects, people who are living there and they get the jobs.
More questions? Gentleman in the back.
Hello. My name is Ambrose.
Yep.
Fine. I just want to confirm something. Still on job creation. Personally, I think it doesn't. I think using the wind energy is an avenue to actually use the wind as a base load while we replace coal power plant, right? And if that's the case, chances are that people on the coal plant, which is coal thermal plant, will lose jobs, while we create more jobs on the other side. So my concerns are, what if we lose professionals on the thermal power plants, like the coal power plant side, and we create jobs on the wind side? Are we creating jobs equally for professionals or technicians? Or are there actually plans on that? Because from what I've observed so far, trainings for wind energies are not included in the formal educational system. And if it's obtainable that way, then I see a system where we create jobs for technicians and engineers lose jobs on the other side. So that's my concern, please.
Thank you very much. Or did I understand you well that you say, okay, these employment effects, these are green jobs, but on the other hand, people working on coal, they will lose the jobs. This was the first part. Did I get it right? Yeah. Yeah, I think you're totally right. And but this is what we are evaluating, or the data we are looking for, or we got in our monitoring report. It's we don't say it's additional employment effects. It's employment effect. Of course, you're right. There may be industries or sectors where jobs are cut, where there are, of course. This is more a methodological question, I think, about measuring green jobs and not so regional. If I get you right.
Yeah, last question. We need to move along. Go ahead, gentleman over here. You've got a microphone coming to you.
Thank you. With the move to electric vehicles, if we stop using fossil fuels for transport, the requirement for electricity will be massive compared to what we have now. And my initial calculations suggest that we will need to keep all our coal power stations going for quite some time while we ramp up everything else in order to be able to replace fossil fuels with electric vehicles. Are you looking at this at all?
Yes. I think these topics like energy storage is covered as well, and of course e-mobility is a topic in this. Right now I can't say, or I can't tell you in which region there are high potentials or low potentials. But in general, of course, we are looking at the storage of energy storage and also the transport of energy. Yep.
I think maybe Paolo might want to address that in the next session. But the nice thing about e-mobility in terms of primary energy, it only uses about 15% as much as you need from oil or coal for transport. Well, not coal.
So First of all, this is down to earth. It will be a much lower scientific level. This is first. Second, apologies for those who already listened to me this morning, because the slides many are really the same, but I will try to fine-tune and pitch my wording to get some things that maybe are more interesting for you. Now, the point here is to get all what you discussed in the global and the big picture. Wind in the world, and wind among renewables and renewables among all the rest. And let's start with 2016, because 2016 is a year for records for renewables, multiple ones. The first is the total installed capacity, more than 160 gigawatt. This is not only the record ever in terms of absolute terms, but it's 2/3 of net power capacity additions of the all mix. So already renewables had slightly surpassed fossil fuels in 2015. Now it's very clear, 2/3, and this will not change in the coming 5 years. If you look at the different installed capacities, the wind market, as you know, shrunk last year, so there were less than PV for the first time. I'm sorry, for the second time. Thank you, I have my lawyer there who protects me. Now, solar had indeed a very record year, a 50% year-on-year growth, driven by exceptional growth in China, which is no longer exceptional because 2017 will be even more exceptional. But the most important thing here is, if you look at retirements, massively in coal and a little bit less in gas, for the first time, a renewable fuel, a non-hydro renewable fuel, was the biggest, the largest source of renewable of total electricity capacity in the world. And what is amazing is that this will not change in the 5 years to come. This is in capacity. Solar will be the leader. Not in generation. In generation, we will have a different leader. And this is the historic. So you can see how fossil fuels growth in the power generation in the previous decade. In the first year of the second decade, we were at pair, renewables with fossil fuels, and this is what we see coming. Renewables in total growing, we are speaking about growth, new generation growth, double than the fossil fuels, and wind is the 40% of that, and it is the single largest growth of generation in the years to come. Overall, the renewables will grow by over 1/3 in the next 5 years, surpassing 8,000 terawatt-hours and reaching 30% of total world electricity generation. This is an increase of 1% per year on average, which is a massive success story, I can tell you, which is driven by a number of countries. I will come in a minute. Now, one very important point is the cost, which is a driving force here, is the cost reductions. These are the old, real auction prices and the announced auction prices average globally for solar PV and wind until 2020, 2022. We don't have these figures for 2022. And you can see how massively these prices went down. In the case of wind, they had a little bit of bumpy figure, which reflects some issues with some auctions. But in the case of solar PV, this is really striking, a factor 2 of decrease between 2014 and 2017, and another factor 2 to 2.5 in the 3 years to come. Now, this is a remarkable process, which is the combination of 3 factors: good policies, more competition with the auctions, and technology progress. One very important point here, for instance, for wind, with new turbines capable to generate more kilowatt-hour per or megawatt-hour per megawatt in regions that are less rich in wind, and this has smashed down the cost, the generation cost per kilowatt-hour. One important remark is that if you look at average LCOEs, they are higher than these auctions because of mainly of administratively set tariffs in countries like China, Japan, other main markets, which make that the average prices of renewables are actually much higher than the auctions cost. If we look at the recent auctions, however, it is safe to say that in the best cases in the world, you have both wind and solar PV capable to generate at around 3 to 5 cents per kilowatt hour, which definitely make them the least cost options in many countries. Not everywhere, but in many countries. This morning it was mentioned there are two tipping points. One, when new renewables are cheaper than new fossil fuels, and we are already there in many countries. And the second is when new renewables are cheaper than existing coal, for instance. We are not there everywhere, but this is coming, and the cost will continue to go down. And part of that is because of technology improvement. Now, geographically, all this is driven and has been already driven in the last 5 years by China, first of all, by the European Union, and then the US and the other markets. And this is what we see coming next. China remains and actually accelerates its undisputed leadership role in renewables growth worldwide, with almost more than 350 gigawatt of new capacity additions coming online in the next 5 years, followed by the United States. Some may be surprised about that, but the state policies in the States are good. The phase out of the tax credit should resist, we hope. And the fundamentals of renewables in the United States are very good in terms of resources, much better than Europe, for instance. Now, the other thing is that India is emerging, in particular because of solar PV, and it's actually equaling European Union in the growth and surpassing it under certain circumstances. Now, if you look far on the right, you have Africa and Middle East together. You can see that this share overall, it's a limited share of the growth, but still don't underestimate the pace of change, because Africa is quickly doubling the size of the cumulative capacities of renewables, of all renewables altogether. Now, we run a base case and also an accelerated case. Why? Despite the fact that they are cheaper and cheaper, this does not mean that the investment flows into renewables automatically. This means this depends on their value in the market. In wholesale marginal cost market, wind and solar have a higher system loss than the others. Why? Very easily, because when is it the time when prices are low? When demand is low and when there is a lot of zero marginal cost production from wind and solar. And conversely, the prices are high when wind and solar production is low and demand is high. So wind and solar, if the rules do not change of market, suffer more in wholesale market prices, which raises the question whether wholesale market price systems, which are recognized everywhere for efficient dispatching, are actually adequate and appropriate to foster the transition. And this is a question everywhere worldwide. Now, so even with cheaper cost, wind and solar very much depend on policies. And we estimate that with better policies in some countries, we could go to an accelerated forecast. It's still a forecast, but it depends on these policies. If these policies are applied in the next 12 to 24 months, you can see the impacts already in 2022. Let me give you a few examples. China, an accelerated power market reform, which is going right now. An accelerated and smooth implementation of the quota obligations on those who pollute, on the utilities, which is solving the issue of the financial burden on consumers of the funds for renewables, and better grid connection and more distributed energy, which has never really taken off in China yet. It is starting right now. If those four things happen, China installs more than 450 gigawatt of renewables in 5 years. You think this is inconceivable? Don't forget that China installed almost 30,000 megawatt this year in 4 months, from April to July, and it probably will install more than 45,000 megawatts of PV in 1 year, which is more than the total cumulative installed capacity of Germany. This is to give you a taste of the change. Now, of course, then, China has severe curtailment problems, which derive from many things. It derives from how investments are done in China, at the level of the fact that the best resources are in the west, in the north, in the south, and not in the east, where they're the biggest demand. But this is, I would say, work in progress that the Chinese government is well aware of. India, to give you 2 examples, grid reinforcement and looking at the financial health of distributed companies seriously. India is a complex reality. We had a chat this morning with Steve. We are relatively optimistic. Indeed, the targets of India are not met here in our forecast, so they are very nervous about us. But it is a serious improvement. So overall, if an accelerated case, we see an installation of more than 1,100 gigawatt in 5 years. This is an enormous amount of new technologies of renewables and of investment. Now, a little bit more of figures of wind. This is may well known to you, but it's always worth recalling. Originally a European story, then the United States, and then China emerging very quickly. And this is what we see, with China surpassing and becoming the leader in cumulative generation of wind by the end of our forecast period by 2022. Followed by the European Union, which remains strong, in particular also now with the new wave of offshore, although you don't see very much offshore generation in this graph. It would, you would need to see to 2025 to see it, and then all the other parts. Sub-Saharan Africa, a little part of that. Wind would represent 3% of Sub-Saharan Africa electricity by 2022, but once again, you have to start somewhere, and the pace of velocity of change is, it keeps me optimistic. I will come back on this. Now, why? Because if you look at the total numbers, the total number of installed renewable capacity in Sub-Saharan Africa is limited if you compare it with the huge numbers that I was mentioning. In total is less than 40 gigawatt, and I was speaking about 1,150 gigawatt of growth. But it's going to grow by 70% in our base case, and by more than the double actually, in the case of the accelerated case, which we think is possible in Sub-Saharan Africa as well, at the very condition that the governance is capable to have transparent, competitive, and equal level playing field procedures and administrative procedures in place. Now, just a few examples of different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa is reminding that the potential of all renewables in Africa is immense. In terms of potential resources, there is no doubt that the continent could run just on renewables, and this would be certainly technically feasible. I would like to remind this. South Africa is leading the growth in non-hydro technologies, while Ethiopia is leading on hydro, Kenya in geothermal. There is a diverse and very interesting mix, which also opens a different kind of story, not immediately, but in the longer term, because a more interconnected Africa would open many, many different possibilities for more flexibility in the system and would completely erase the issue of the variability of wind and solar in the continent. And now let me precisely go to the system integration of wind and solar, which is the next frontier. The costs of wind and solar now are so low that this mantra that we were keeping hearing until 2 years, and in some cases 1 year ago, that the renewables are too expensive, this is no longer really existing. And my preferred case in this is really India, which made a U-turn on this. Still 1 year ago, you would hear, we need to grow, we need to cheap coal, that's it. Renewables are expensive. The only region in the world where you can still hear that is Southeast Asia, is ASEAN countries. Now, the second barrier, the preferred use argument is, but solar and wind are intermittent. Yes. And they need backup. They need storage. Now, solar and wind do not need just backup or storage. They actually need flexible power systems that are integrating them in a reliable and cost-effective manner, and I will come back in a minute on that. But this slide is dedicated to those who think or continue to claim that you can only integrate a few percentages of renewables in the grid. It's mainly a European story, with Denmark being absolutely the leader, and other countries which are very safely integrating massive quantities of wind and solar. In some cases, in some countries, wind and solar have produced 100% of demand, or in the case of Denmark, actually 120% of demand, being a net exporter, and nothing happened. We had no blackouts, for very good reasons. Now, yeah, maybe the settings were different. For sure, the settings were different, by the way. Now, this is what we see coming in 2022, with Denmark hitting almost 70% from variable renewables. And Ireland is actually the most tricky part, because Ireland is facing stability issues, which were mentioned before by the lady of South Australia, very correctly, that Denmark doesn't see, because it's so well interconnected with the Nordic power pool market. But Ireland sees them because it has a little interconnection with the UK. It's a small island, it's a small system, and so if you have a problem with 30% plus of wind, then you get in trouble, and you need to have some inertia in the system. All the others that are following show that a number of things can be done to integrate massive quantities of renewables in a cost-effective way. I would like to repeat that, A, this is not a technical issue. It is purely an economic issue. So technically, you could have a system running 100% on renewables, and even 100% running on mostly variable renewables, but it's an economic issue. Now, what do you need to do that? First of all, better system and market operation. And I don't want certainly to put the finger on Southern Australia, but the setting issue is an example. To have rule in place that guarantees that the system works and operates also in an extreme event like this in the perfect way. By the way, in the recent Caribbean hurricanes, many solar plants have perfectly resisted the hurricane. All the rest of the system was down, and the solar plants and the island system continued to work. This is just another example of how much more resilient system you could have with more distributed renewables. Market operation, apart from the market design, you may think that weather forecasting and wind forecasting and state-of-the-art wind forecasting should be everywhere. We are at stellar distance from this. There are some countries that are super advanced and that are capable to track the performance and the production and to forecast the performance and production of every single wind machine in the country. Spain is an example. And others are incredibly not well organized in this, which should be the fundamental number one if you want to integrate a variable resource like wind, or equally on solar. The second thing is we need flexibility, and flexibility has 4 dimensions. It is not just backup, It is not just storage, although of course both help. It is about stronger grid and grid interconnections for a very simple reason. If you have a larger balancing area, the variability will be much, much, much smoother, and you can always play with electricity flows from where you have an excess or a variable supply to your demand centers. The second is dispatchable supply. In systems that have a lot of fossil fuels, there is a huge amount of flexibility available if you have the rules and the settings to use it correctly. Of course, gas is the easiest one, but you can also have flexible coal, like in Germany. So those who say that coal cannot operate flexibly, actually, they don't, let's say, they are not precise. Let's put it in this way. I'm not advocating here to keeping a lot of fossil fuels. I'm almost done. I'm just saying you can operate it much better. And by the way, this reminds me about your question on electric vehicles. The electric vehicles are an issue of capacity, not of electricity consumption, and you have to make sure that people recharge not everybody at the same time, and not everybody with a fast charging, because otherwise you really get in trouble. But otherwise, this equation that this will increase massively the energy consumption, that's not true. It's a capacity issue. Now, last point, you need to do much more system-friendly renewable policies. The old policies based on feed-in tariffs, they don't give value to where and when the electricity is produced. You will need to have much more sophisticated renewable policies looking much better at distributed resource integration, system services, time and location profiles, and all this possibly in a good technology mix and integrated planning. In theory, South Africa has all of this, apart from the locational signals, in theory. Of course, we look forward, we as the IA also look forward to re-see progress in the area IPPP program and seeing the IRP one day. Now, yeah, let's see. If you want to have an example of sophisticated policies, look at Mexico. Mexico at the moment has the most advanced and most sophisticated work in progress that looks at system-friendly processes. Now, some concluding in general and some then for wind R&D. The first is very simple. Wind is going to become the single largest source of no generation growth, not in the distant future. It is now, and it will be in the next 5 years, and it actually will stay forever. In the sustainable development scenario of the WIO that was published yesterday in London, wind is the single largest generation source of every other power generation source, followed by hydro, then by solar, and then all the rest. And coal will shrink to 6% of the generation mix in such a scenario. I say will, I should say would, if we were capable to put the necessary policies. In general, the pace of change of renewables is impressive. 1,000 gigawatt in any case, that's the average of the two cases, installed in the next 5 years. This is half of the total coal cumulative capacity in the world that required 80 years to be built. The generation will exceed 8,000 terawatt-hours by 2022, equal to total electricity consumption of China, India, and Germany combined. And then my next 2 points are on system integration. The next phase is really system integration and looking much more at the heating and transport sector with smart sector coupling. So the issue is exactly the control of a smart grids, and the digitalization will offer plenty of opportunities to optimize this. And of course, we need, however, evolve in both policies and market design for a cost-effective integration. And now let me conclude on some priorities, if I manage to manage this. Yes. For R&D. Now, these are coming from something that you should be aware of. The IA has a small secretariat in Paris, where I'm coming from, and a large network of experts that work in technology collaboration programs. There is one on wind. These ideas are coming from them. these TCPs are open to all non-member countries and institutions, and so this is an opportunity for you to have more information and also to get in touch with them. The first is an emphasis on the accuracy of resource mapping, which, believe it or not, is still a big, big problem in countries, in many countries, and of course, if you don't have a good map, you will not attract the investors. The second is the wind predictability. As I mentioned, it's astonishing to see how in many countries the wind forecasting is very poor, yet now in 2017. The third is to look at hybrid systems. More and more, we think we will see hybrid renewables power plants coming online, mixing hydro, solar, and wind where possible, and maybe in the future something else. We have some very interesting examples, in particular now with solar and hydro, but wind should be together. And on that, I would mention one thing. If you look at the places where wind and solar are more complementary, you can have an incredible result. You have solar plus wind at around 3 cents for 5,000 full load hours. There are places like the desert of Atacama, Australia, Western Africa, I suspect also some parts in South Africa here, where this could happen. Now, of course, these places are in the middle of nowhere. So you would immediately say, why should we go there to produce where demand is far away? But you could make cheap hydrogen and then have a vector, a liquid or gaseous vector, hydrogen, probably ammonia, that can be then transported and exported to the world. And this is what we will see, a wave of investment of these things coming, in particular in Australia, in the next years. So the other things is on cost of wind. Cost remains very important. And my preferred point is all the vast research that needs to look at system value of wind and, of course, solar. We don't need to focus anymore just on the single technology lowest generation cost. We need to focus at the places where wind and solar bring the largest value to the system. That's the most challenging academic, intellectual challenge that all of us have ahead of us. I would stop here, and I hope that you have some questions, not too difficult, that I can answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. There are wind and solar hybrid projects in northeast Brazil and in India as well. We have time for very few questions.
Yes, a couple comments. First one is about the resource mapping. In the Wind Europe conference coming up in Amsterdam in a couple of weeks, a new global wind atlas will be released. Good. And actually it shows a lot of resource in Sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a nice thing. And I really, really like your point about forecasting. But there is a very large problem, which is, for example, in a country like South Africa, when you try to get public money to develop forecasting systems, they say, no, the industry should do that. Mm. And then when you ask the industry, they say, oh no, the market is too small, they only a few % of wind energy, it's not worth developing forecasting systems. So what can we do to get over this? Because it will come and we'll need these systems, and they should be under development before the wind farms are built.
Now, if I see two things which are pretty obvious. One, to give more certainty on the market, because this would attract immediately the interest of the companies, and the companies would invest more on that. And secondly, of course, if you had an independent system operator that looks at the resources, there would be a clear social interest in looking at this issue that make the overall cost for the nation lower and that optimize the system. This should be, in the places where system operators are really independent, they work well to minimize the costs of the system for the good of the whole nation, and they don't care who is supplying the energy.
Gentleman in the back.
Thank you very much, sir. On Monday, I and some couple of my friends were having some intellectual arguments concerning the use of the wind as well as the solar production. So I want to ask, do you think it is possible at any stage that the solar power will be will fizzle out of the system? Is it possible that we can get to a point in which we will no longer going to be needing the solar power again and we'll concentrate majorly on the wind?
I'm not sure I got your question right. Are you saying...
Okay, my question basically is...
Where we will need no more policies?
Do you think it is possible for us to get to a point in which we are not going to be needing solar energy again as an alternate source of power?
That you don't need solar power?
I am asking, is it possible to get to that point in which we are no longer we will not be needing solar power again?
Why would you? Sorry, I'm not sure I got your question. Yeah. If this is going to be among one of the cheapest options that you have, and you have a cheap resource, why wouldn't you use it?
No, we're looking at the fact that, looking at the total production of wind energy, for example.
Yes.
Wind energy produces more than solar energy.
Yes.
From what you've heard. So I am asking, is it possible to get to a point in which we're no longer going to rely on solar energy again? So it's going to be basically on wind energy?
No. I don't have the calculation in front of me, but I really don't see the sense of why you would wish that. You should, look, there is no technology on Earth that makes alone, that gives the response. You should always to look for portfolio technologies, options, and you should look at those portfolios that are more robust. Robust in terms of lower cost, of system reliability, and low carbon emissions and low air pollution, and to be affordable, of course. This is what you really want. The response is definitely in portfolios, and you should look for cheap, reliable options, and I see both wind and solar very cheap, becoming very cheap and very reliable. If you want some numbers, I repeat now the WEO numbers for 2040 in the Sustainable Development Scenario. I go in by heart now. So wind is at 6,950 terawatt-hours, and PV is at 5,900. There is no reason really that you will want to see one to completely prevail on the other one.